Ahoy! My name's Melany. We're all familiar with the concept of a licensed kids game, right? Take a show or movie or whatever appeals to kids, license it out to a publisher to commission a game studio to develop a game under a strict budget and deadline, and then boom, you make money. These games aren't huge nowadays, but they still do occur. However, the peak of games like this would undoubtedly be the 6th and 7th generation of game consoles. You know, the ones, the GameCube, the Wii, DS, PS2, and most notable for this video, the Game Boy Advance. Now, a key factor regarding the licensed kids games is a low budget. However, the drawback for a lower budget is that during this era of gaming, you would really start to notice when developers would cheap out. However, in regards for the Game Boy Advance, this system was infamously cheap to develop for, meaning a licensed kids game of GBA was honestly inevitable. Or if a new game was coming to consoles, it'd be pretty cheap to commission a small game studio to squirt out a GBA version of the game. It may have nothing to do with the source game, but who cares, it didn't need to. The studios just wanted another game on the shelf with the same title for Game Boy Advance so kids and unknowing parents would buy it in hopes of it being the same thing as the console port. And that's how we get games like these. So today, let's take a close look at a random selection of licensed kids games for Game Boy Advance that I happen to own. Let's start off innocently enough with The Incredibles for Game Boy Advance. Now, I want to quickly apologize for this game appearing a bit cropped on screen right now. I recorded all this GBA gameplay on my soft mod GameCube, and I accidentally selected the incorrect aspect ratio and Game Boy interface, so apologies for the cropped gameplay. Anyways, here we are, The Incredibles. This game seemingly takes us through the events of the film. So we start off flashback into the past during the superhero golden age. First impressions are pretty solid. The music and sound effects for Game Boy Advance standards at least are pretty charming. The graphics aren't horrible. I've always kinda liked how GBA games looked, kind of reimagining games in almost an SNES style. Albeit, some characters just look really off. Mr. Incredible looks like he's chewing on his own jaw. This is a side-scrolling beat-em-up, most akin to arcade games. The controls are a bit clunky in my usage though. Like here in the beginning, I couldn't really get the hang of double jumping, though I'll take the blame for that one. My instinct was just kinda to mash the A button to double jump, but instead what the game wants you to do is jump, wait till you reach the peak height, and then jump again. It's weird and not really what I was expecting, but it works, so meh. Also, something that's pretty common for these cheap licensed games is the use of a password system instead of a battery save feature. It's not the end of the world, I suppose, but it's pretty lame, and it's also one of the best ways to tell if a game was not very high priority for the publisher. Anyways, progressing through, I do have to complain that they sure do love to keep these enemies f***ing going. And also, as far as I can tell from what I played, there is barely any enemy variety of any kind. Every single enemy you fight in a level is pretty much just the exact same over and over again. And your approach to each level is always the exact same thing. Just essentially button mashing. Like, there are special moves and combos and such, but what's the fucking point when you can just button mash your way through it? And this game's idea of a difficulty spike is essentially just to ramp up the amount of enemies on screen for you to fight at once. Also, there's this part where you play as Frozone, and wow is he awful to play as. So the idea is that you're Frozone running on ice on the top of a building, and you need to avoid the non-ice parts, otherwise you're gonna tumble to the ground. You're supposed to be able to make ramps for non-ice parts, but I couldn't get that to work for some reason most of the time. And whatever I'm doing this section, it feels almost as if it's just going too fast for me to be able to keep up with. There's also item pickups along the way, but good fucking luck getting them. Also, make sure you don't run out of ice. And then after beating it, it's back to the monotonous gameplay of beating up enemies as Mr. Incredible. It's really mindless and not in a good way. Sometimes I'll admit, I enjoy a good mindless game. It's kind of relaxing. But this is the kind of mindless game that's just outright boring. Anyways, as we continue on, we get to, oh my fucking god. So, you know how in the movie, how Mr. Incredible saves someone from committing suicide? Yeah, they included that part. In this licensed kids game, you have to save someone from committing suicide. Why was this included in the game? Like, I can't be crazy here thinking that that was pretty fucking dark for an inclusion in the tie-in video game. I know it's included in the movie, but given it's a PG-rated movie with a darker tone than most Pixar movies, it's fine with me there for the most part, albeit it's definitely a bit triggering for some. But in the E-rated video game, this was a dark turn I wasn't expecting. Also, Jesus Christ, Mr. Incredible, that's a bit much to say after saving him. With counseling, I think you'll come to forgive me. Jesus Christ. On a much lighter note, god, I love this animation of 32-bit Mr. Incredible wheezing. Continuing on with the game, we have a boss fight with Bon Voyage. Honestly, this was okay. It gets a bit lame when he summons the generic crook enemy, but Bon Voyage is at least a pretty interesting boss for once, and more unique than the rest of the enemies. After beating him, the story cutscenes take place to fill us in on the rest of the story. You know how it goes, Mr. Incredible gets his fanboy arrested, he gets married, the lawsuits force the supers into hiding. However, it then skips ahead a considerable amount of the runtime of the movie, to the part where Mr. Incredible goes to the volcanic island. This skips about 20 minutes of the movie's runtime, which strikes me as incredibly odd. I suppose the dev team really only had the means to do the beat 'em up type levels and didn't want to do much else. I don't know, I was kind of expecting a minigame of some sort in the missing 20 minutes. Like, for example, why couldn't there have been a minigame for the burning building scene, for example? But whatever, Mr. Incredible wakes up in the jungle, and this is around where my timer for each game ended and I lost interest in playing. I was happy to have some level and enemy variety in this area, but this is just a very boring and shallow distraction. It's not the worst thing I've ever played, but that's not exactly a very high bar. Alright, so on the topic of Pixar, here's Cars for Game Boy Advance. So, unlike the Incredibles game, it doesn't try to follow the events of the film, but rather try to act as a sequel of sorts. So let's hop into a level and whoa, okay. So I was kind of expecting a racer, kind of like Mario Kart Super Circuit, but instead it's a poorly controlled isometric racer. Wow, I hate this. I'll be the first to admit that I have some serious skill issues here, but this feels shallow even beneath that. Like, the controls are so ungodly sensitive, and I straight up just never got the hang of it. Hence why the gameplay you're watching includes me sucking straight up ass at this game. The screen is crunched so hard that you can't really see upcoming turns, so this game has to literally tell you when a turn is coming. But I can never get the timing down. And the worst part about this game is that I straight up just started feeling really nauseous after about 20 minutes of playing. I'll confess, I didn't play very long, mostly for the sake of my stomach. I have never, ever experienced that before. Like, don't get me wrong, I've gotten motion sick playing VR games, but never before have I gotten motion sick at just a regular ass video game. So, for this being the first game I've talked about on this channel to make me physically ill, this game gets tossed in the corner to think about what it's done. But of course, we're not done with Cars yet, because to my horror, this game has a sequel, Cars Major National Championship. Fucking joy. Alright, let's get into this and select a character. It's pretty cool that I managed to get full 3D models in the character selection screen. It's not anything special, of course, but for GBA standards, wow, is this impressive. Alright, let's get into this, and whoa, it's a fully 3D racer? Like, don't get me wrong here, the racing itself isn't anything to write home about, but wow, for being a GBA game in full 3D, it gets a pass for me. There's even exclusive features for the Game Boy player in the form of changing your car's perspective. From what I played this game, it's really nothing special at all. For just being as graphically interesting as it is, it gets high marks for me. Alright, let's switch gears from Pixar for a moment and talk about something else. Here's Spongebob, Battle for Bikini Bottom. Now, this game on consoles is an iconic cult classic that I'm almost sure everyone here has either heard of or seen a video discussing it. Well, given how this was an era of nearly every single game under the sun getting a GBA port, let's try the GBA version of this game. This game was developed by Vicarious Visions, a game developer for Activision. These days, they've been renamed to Blizzard Albany, which kinda sucks, but they've developed a lot of common license games back in the day. However, later on in the developer's life, they went on to tackle bigger games like some of the Skylanders games, Crash Bandicoot Insane Trilogy, and the Tony Hawk remakes. So clearly a very competent and talented studio, no doubt. However, this game was seemingly just another licensed kids game project. The game follows the same premise as the console version. Plankton makes a shit ton of evil robots, forgets to flip the obey switch, and now they're taking over Bikini Bottom. Before even getting into this game, I just want to make a note that I really love how the world map looks. I like how it features the sketchy Spongebob from the intro logo. That's really cute. And then getting into the game itself, the game doesn't look that bad. It's not great either, but for GBA, I've totally seen worse. We have a pretty basic moveset, jump, glide, and blow bubbles. The game itself, however, it's honestly not too bad. It's a pretty basic linear platformer, there's a bunch of robots on screen at all times, and strangely, most of them aren't enemies like you'd expect, but rather you're supposed to just jump on their heads a lot of the time to progress through the level. The game is a bit of a collectathon too, with a limited number of Krabby Patties and golden spatulas to collect. You do need to collect every single spatula in each level to progress though, however. So if you reach the end of a level without one, you need to backtrack and collect it, which I found really annoying. I understand they want to encourage exploration, but I'd rather the spatulas just be a collectible for getting 100% and nothing more. The controls feel totally solid too. I feel like most platformers in the licensed kids game genre kind of screw up the controls more often than not, so it's really nice to see that they managed to get the controls down pretty well. Honestly, this game is pretty solid. It's nowhere near as great as its console counterpart, but why the f were you expecting it to be that? For what this game is worth, it's not bad at all. You could have done a lot worse as a kid picking out a game from Toys R Us. Okay, here's a game I bought at a local game store of mine for less than $5 just for shits and giggles. The Santa Claus 3: The Escape Clause. I had zero expectations going into this game. Unlike any of the other games for this video, I have absolutely no connection to the Santa Claus movies. I've never seen them, never grew up on them, nothing. So I was honestly expecting this game to not even make the cut for this video. But imagine my surprise when I sat down and played this game. I really liked it. Like, it's not the most amazing game in the world, but for what it is, it's really fun. It's easily the best game of the lot today. Santa's controls in game feel 100%. Super satisfying and responsive. The level design is really fun and creative too. Visually, while not amazing, it's not terrible and works well enough. The moveset is really solid too. The soundtrack isn't great, however, I will lament that, but it's not the end of the world. Just listen to Spotify or YouTube in the background and you're all good to go. There's a solid level of difficulty to this game, and it kept me coming back and wanting to try again. When I died, it rarely ever felt like it was anyone's fault but mine. I played this game for a couple hours and I really enjoyed myself, and chances are I'm gonna come back to this game when I'm done with this video to finish it. To tell you the truth, I'm shocked, and I'm even more shocked when I found out who developed this game. This game was developed by a studio called First Playable Productions, and while they have mostly seemed to have just made licensed kids games, do you know what other game they developed? The crappy Olaf game I talked about in the licensed 3DS games video. I'm utterly shocked given how much I hated that Olaf game. I'm not gonna sit around here and say this is some crazy amazing game on the Game Boy Advance and that it's totally beating out the other 2D platforms on GBA, but like, I totally recommend this game as a solid little platform to play on the holidays. It's crazy dirt cheap too, so you really have nothing to lose. Go try this game, it's a lot of fun. I'm noticing a lot of my licensed kids games for this video are Disney games, as evident by the next game we're covering, Disney Princess. So in my 3DS games video, we talked about another Disney Princess game. However, this one is for the Game Boy Advance or something, I don't know. What do you want me to say about this game for an introduction? I bought this game complete in box for some ungodly reason one night on eBay. The box is pink. Okay, that's probably enough introduction, let's get into the game. This is, by all accounts, one of those games for girls we used to see when licensed games were popular. In playing this game, God, I feel bad for the poor kid who had this game growing up. Listen, I understand this is a game for kids, so it makes sense to be slower and dumbed down a tiny bit, but this game feels like it's such a slog to the point where it feels almost patronizing. Like, here you go girls, you're probably gonna handle a real game that's fun anyway. Like, all of these games I'm discussing today have similar age demographics, I'm sure, and I can safely say that this is the slowest paced game I got for this video. There's about 6 campaigns based upon various Disney Princess stories to pick from, and they're all pretty mindless and slow. I started with Belle. When dropped in, I was tasked with finding an enchanted rose. Getting into this game, there's this howling animal noise that just continuously goes off every 5 seconds or so, and it's so dreadfully annoying. Your character goes agonizingly slow. You're supposed to be jumping onto these branches and shit, but good fucking luck with that. It's honestly just a chore to do anything in this game. There's these wolves that go after you in which you just defeat them by jumping on them. Throughout the level, you're picking up various collectibles in which I have never cared to figure out what any of them were for. The levels are incredibly long and very slow to get through. This is where I noticed something about all of these games. They're all lacking true substance, and I find that the Disney Princess game here is the worst example of this. There's nothing here. Even while playing and gathering notes for this video, I found not a whole lot to talk about. This game struggles with the fact of trying to have multiple campaigns in a single game, where I think a full game specifically designed around one princess and her story would have worked far better and allowed for more polish. But even then, that's debatable with the low budget these games were likely given. Each one of these games we looked at today was just another excuse to put another game on the shelf, another game for easy money, because parents would believe it's the same game as another version. But most of the time, these are just inferior in so many ways that it's nearly impossible to make a substantial video on one of them. Even doing multiple games was a struggle. Where licensed games on consoles were often annoying, they were at least full-fledged games. They had substantial content and a whole lot to talk about. These handheld games struggle to meet the bare minimum of what I would even qualify as a game. It's shocking looking back at seeing how vastly different these games were compared to their console counterparts. In a way, it almost feels like false advertising. But I mean, there's Lightning McQueen, so I guess it is a Cars video game. But it's not what the child who begged their mom for these games was expecting, and it's why these games aren't looked back on as fondly as their console variant. And honestly, I'm glad this has stopped. Because just from this small batch, the games clearly suffer from this desire to have it everywhere, rather than making a polished experience for only a few platforms. I know a lot of people miss the days of licensed kids games, and honestly, me too. But it makes too much sense that this business practice died off. And while I sometimes miss them, I think I'm glad that licensed kids games have now evolved into being mostly pretty solid games based on a licensed property, rather than merely a cheap cash grab for young audiences. And I think that's all I have to say for now. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing and clicking the like button. I know it's annoyingly cliche, but it really does help out a ton. And if you're interested, come hang out on Discord, Twitter, or Instagram. Thanks so much for watching, I hope you all have a lovely day, and hopefully, I might even see you next time. Bye bye!